The guy known as Hollywood's kindest director, Ron Howard, has now come clean about his breaking point. The Oscar-winning director, who is 71, listed the 6 actors he allegedly detested working with the most, citing anything from flamboyant egos to startling betrayals. These are Hollywood war stories rather than merely creative disputes. Who, then, caused Ron to become impatient? Which iconic figure almost put him off balance? This film reveals the reality behind rare interviews, leaked stories, and decades of silent strain. You'll be shocked at number 2, so pay attention. 6. Ron Howard and Tom Sizemore conduct their sets like a symphony. Every player knows when to enter, the pace is constant, and the baton is quiet. Control that feels undetectable, the kind that allows actors to forget the machinery and sink into reality, is the aim, not anarchy. That's why the atmosphere supposedly changed from metronome to meteor storm when Tom Sizemore joined Ransom in 1996. Sizemore had a lot of power. Raw, magnetic, and gritted. He had the exact passion that audiences adored. Precisely the kind of instability that is difficult for a clockwork factory to handle. There was a noticeable strain in the air, as crew members would subsequently recall. Feel that one person's energy might suddenly rise or crash, so the scene you practiced might not be the one you photographed. Howard has a straightforward philosophy. Freedom comes from preparation. You make plans to provide a secure playground for discovery. According to insiders, Sizemore's method went against that cadence. Promises didn't feel like call sheets. They had the feel of recommendations. An entrance could spark and then become out of style. In the very next take, a line could appear like static after coming out electrifying. People said it had nothing to do with dialogue being forgotten or missing marks. The environment was bent around it because of an unpredictable element. Such ambiguity quickly becomes costly on a Howard set, where serenity is the norm. In faith, in attention, and in time. Once, in cautious, whispered tones, it was stated that the production had to halt abruptly. It was because the emotional weather was off, not because the lights had gone out or the cameras had jammed. It seems that Howard, being so tactful, requested for a reset. Although there was no public reprimand, there were no raised voices. Reblocking coverage and changing the shot order appeared to be his main moves. As well as reorganize the day according to his actual energy level rather than what the timetable predicted. It is crisis management done with soft power. Contain rather than escalate. There was no explosion of sound on the scene. Everyone understood the subtext, yet it blew out. It is a flair when the director maintains the rhythm at that scale. The clock occasionally bleeds minutes. The pictures in this chapter are effective, which makes it intriguing. Sizemore is coiled, frightening, alive, and crackles in Ransom when he appears on film. According to reports, Howard once again demonstrated his ability to transform clumsy genius into crisp frames, making quick adjustments like a seasoned quarterback interpreting a failed play. However, the workflow showed the toll. Resets had to be handled by assistant directors, who were always the production's triage nurses. Department heads became more stringent. Their dialogue. The egalitarian, courteous, silently applauding, set family atmosphere that Howard creates has to put on a suit of armor. Even when no one speaks, you can sense that kind of tension. It occurs between setups and veers toward a lunch break rhythm. Contrary to what some close to Howard would have you believe, the lesson was more about borders than it was about assigning blame. The spirit is passion. On a movie set, discipline is an attribute that maintains it. Trust breaks out between the director and the crew, between the actor and the director, and most importantly, between the film and the timeline when it becomes like a roulette wheel. Howard didn't preach. He created. He discovered performance beats that didn't require ideal circumstances to land, reduced variables, and raised coverage insurance. When Sizemore passed away in 2023, Howard didn't release lengthy remarks or grandiose elegies, and spectators noticed the quiet. In other words, he created volatility and saved the film without publicly shattering the man. Perhaps distance, rather than cruelty, is the most telling conclusion. The Ransom incident turned into a case study on the price of unpredictability for a director who values planning. The crew waits as the day comes to an end. Although the plan changes, the leader decides to contain rather than confront. A clockwork volcano is not a moral judgment. It is an issue of physics. Lava is captivating. It detects the cracks as well. Howard's steady career taught him exactly how to break through those cracks and manage the flow without destroying the studio. The next actor disproved the notion that Ron Howard's patience was unbreakable. Yes. Andy Griffith. At the age of 6, Ron Howard, a red-haired Oklahoman child with an innate charm that glowed on TV, made his debut on the set of The Andy Griffith Show in 1960. He appeared to the world as Opie Taylor, the naive son of Sheriff Andy, who lived in the idyllic village of Mayberry. The set felt like a second home to Ron. And Andy Griffith was like a father figure. He was mentored by Griffith, who taught him the rhythms of performing and supported the boy's intuition. Howard once remarked, "Andy made me feel like I belonged." The mentorship in those early years was kind, lighthearted, and sincere. It appeared to capture the coziness of the program itself. However, the idyllic image started to fall apart as the seasons changed and the demands of success became more pressing. By the middle of the 1960s, Andy Griffith's name was a byword for small-town decency, and the program had become a success. However, insiders saw a change behind the traditional charm. Griffith had turned irritable, reclusive, and occasionally even volatile. Carrying one of the biggest hits on television was a huge burden that started to alter the set's atmosphere. According to crew members, he was. When things didn't go his way, he became domineering and irritable. Ron, who was already approaching adolescence, was particularly aware of the difference. The effortless giggles in between takes became less frequent. The kind advice became abrupt. One cast member subsequently compared it to seeing a July sky cloud over. The first lesson Howard would learn about the difference between his private temperament and public persona would subtly mold him into the filmmaker he would become. Years of experience and self-assurance in his abilities may have been the final straw. It might have happened as a result of growing older and gaining confidence in one's abilities. Howard was no longer content to just hit his targets. He started posing provocative queries regarding motivation, story arcs, and, to Griffith, subtle challenges to power. There was now an edge to the father-son dynamic that had previously been natural. Griffith would not have always agreed with his on-screen son on the increasing independence since he was used to doing things exactly the way he thought they should be done in the end. Crew recollections indicate that on some days, Griffith's annoyance was expressed in brief conversations punctuated by protracted silences. That was puzzling to young Ron. He learned everything he knew about professionalism from this man. However, that perplexity gave way to comprehension. One learns how to deal with dominant personalities from a young age. Later on, he would think about it, particularly when someone could activate the charm for a take and then turn it off entirely in between scenes. Their connection cooled out once his featured show ended in 1968. There were no arguments or rumors about them, only space. They almost never spoke to one another, never collaborated again, and only appeared in the public eye when called upon. Howard went from being a child star to an amateur filmmaker when Griffith became a television icon. He was good-natured and empty of the discipline he had brought with him when he tasted it from there. In a very succinct and well-crafted statement, Howard recalls Griffith's 2012 funeral and says, "He shaped me in ways I am still understanding." Here, there is no resentment. Only limits. He had worked out what his leadership should not look like when he started to design his own directing career. Howard consumed a portion of the power trip in those early days that has remained with him to this day. He later decided that harmony would be a feature of his films that he would be recognized for, completing the warmth that was depicted on screen with the warmth that was hidden behind it. Respect in every way served as the foundation for his production. 1. That relied on gentle communication and respect for one another instead than exaggerated egos. The contrast between his laid-back demeanor and the perception of an emotional genius from the previous century has always been apparent to all who have interacted with him. For Ron, learning from Mayberry was more about the framework than it was about nostalgia. He's seen firsthand how ego and emotional strain may stifle creativity. He began his career in movies on a basis of collaboration, compassion, and reliability. In hindsight, the quiet storm of Mayberry represented the price of leadership under duress rather than just Andy Griffith's subdued, covert instability. Additionally, young artists can learn those concepts by osmosis. Howard saw how charisma hides weakness, how fear doesn't command respect, and even how legends have blind spots, and it became a lifelong study in emotional control. It is his career's conundrum. The kindest director in America was perfected in the shadow of a man who wasn't always polite. He learned the fragility of the small-town dream that shaped his upbringing, as well as how much effort it requires to maintain order when the cameras cease recording. Russell Crowe, number 4. It seemed like the ideal combination when Ron Howard and Russell Crowe first collaborated on A Beautiful Mind in 2001. Howard was the trusted artisan of Hollywood, a filmmaker who struck a balance between discipline and emotion. After winning the Oscar for Gladiator and being admired for his complete character absorption, Crowe was the epitome of intensity during that time. They were destined to create something amazing together. And they did. The movie won both Best Director and Best Picture. However, beneath that elegant, well-executed work of art, there was a daily struggle between two creative forces that took quite different approaches to art. For Howard, making movies required planning, teamwork, and organization. For Crowe, it was instinct and pandemonium, as well as the unrelenting search for emotional truth. More dramatic than anything on screen was the conflict between brilliance and procedure. Crowe viewed the production as a testing ground from the start. He supposedly arrived at work each day with a plethora of ideas, some of which were excellent and others perplexing, while portraying the brilliant but troubled mathematician John Nash. With the kind of conviction typically reserved for directors, he revised lines, questioned dialogue, and discussed camera positioning. Howard walked the tightrope between honoring an actor's dedication and maintaining the production's tempo, and crew members characterized him as patient but clearly exhausted. Harmony and quiet concentration are hallmarks of the director's sets. Creative static filled the room as Crowe's energy surged. Russell didn't only want to play the character, an assistant director subsequently remarked. He desired to subdue it by wrestling. One has an advantage when the world is so straightforward that one can use their astrological sign as a norm. The mighty Roach, Howard's diabolical one, Ben Moxapla, Laurent de Corrent de Tag, and Frat. Having experienced some extremely upsetting times, Howard was rarely angry. He has a history of self-control. Instead of confronting it head-on, energy is diverted when things are run gently. However, Crowe's wildness posed a serious threat to that control. On many days, he had to adjust the entire shooting schedule in the middle of the day to accommodate Crowe's actions. And for Howard, that meant having to make a decision between the two options: changes to sets or coverage in order to continue moving. The film's cadence was consistent with Howard's capacity to tolerate turbulence that would not be transferred to the crew. This was the last step in striking the perfect balance between maintaining the production's discipline to deliver and allowing it to stretch and adapt in order to capture the genius that Crowe might unleash when everything came together. Years later, Howard would comment on the event with his usual grating elegance. A few actors in the scene, you steer. He went on, Russell, you just hang on tight and hope for the best. The conclusion demonstrated Crowe's skill in portraying Nash as one of his best performances of vulnerability and obsession, encasing the entire film, so the tension was irrelevant. The narrative is never overshadowed by the emotional whirlwinds because to Howard's design and the aliveness he incorporated into it. They worked together to build something that neither of them could have done on their own. Naturally, the bond was a major factor, but despite all the accolades and praise from critics, Howard left the production exhausted and refused to collaborate with the actor again, whose method at the time involved a lot of negotiation. For a director who values consistency and trust, it was that magical time when everything was both exciting and exhausting. He had stung his hands, but he had managed to catch lightning in a bottle. Instead, Crowe was someone else. Crowe defended his intensity in interviews by claiming that it is a necessary component of his artistic DNA. I don't come here to win people over, he added. I come here to discover the truth in every situation. He saw it as commitment rather than ego. However, that same dedication could occasionally be interpreted as disobedience. Crowe later expressed his admiration for Howard but alluded to the restricting nature of the latter's stability. In one interview, Ron stated that he prefers a clean and cozy environment. It's uncomfortable to do real art. Although they still respected one another, neither of them dared to cross the chasm between their ideologies. When asked in 2015 if he would ever collaborate with Crowe again, Howard smiled and said that some partnerships are only intended to be done once. Finally, A Beautiful Mind was both a triumph and a warning, stating, "That discord is a necessary part of even creative harmony." It strengthened Howard's conviction that filmmaking is the art of democratically engaging brilliance rather than merely controlling it, above all else. His leadership style was characterized by his ability to be patient during that storm. Calm, flexible, silent, and in charge. The screen glowed with Crowe's genius. However, Howard's self-control made it tolerable. As it were, genius and process weren't at odds. It served as a study of contrasts and an attempt to see whether the two artists might compromise without becoming wholly different. For a while, they performed well. But for Crowe and Howard, that was the moment that won the world. Howard learned a valuable lesson from that as well. Not every magic can be replicated. It's not worth going through every storm twice. If you believe you already know all of Ron Howard's secrets, you will be completely shocked by the following one. Henry Winkler, number 3. Ron Howard was already well known in America when Happy Days debuted in 1974. The Andy Griffith Show's former child star had spent her childhood in front of the camera. The pleasant, all-American youth balancing friendship, romance, and small-town life in the 1950s, Richie Cunningham, epitomized a new sort of nostalgia. He was the focal point of the show. He served as the story's moral compass and heart. Then Henry Winkler entered. As Arthur Fonzie Fonzarelli, he wore leather coats over his shoulder and spoke in a cool, informal tone. The Fonz, a rough guy with a soft spot for Richie, was meant to provide comic relief. However, something unexpected occurred inside a season. The supporting character took center stage. Audiences were captivated by Winkler's charm. He was kind but rebellious. Kind but cool. Everyone aspired to be or befriend this type of guy. The studio management noticed the flood of fan correspondence. Scripts were soon being revised to include less Richie and more Fonzie. The Fonz's travels became the focal point of storylines that had previously centered on Richie's moral quandaries. The marketing for the concert also changed. Winkler was featured more and more in interviews, magazine covers, and posters. The show's anchor, Howard, was immediately in the orbit of a new celebrity. The irony was harsh, as one crew member later acknowledged. The rebel in the leather jacket was overshadowing the clean-cut hero. Howard initially attempted to dismiss it. He was grounded, professional, and truly liked Winkler as a person. Although there was no overt animosity between the two, it hurt on the inside. Witnessing the change in creative direction was devastating for an actor who had carried the show from its debut. Howard would talk about that time with cautious candor years later. "I occasionally wondered where I belonged on the show. I didn't particularly hate Henry, but I did hate the way the story changed around me, and it was even worse because nobody was to blame." Winkler had not become famous by deceit. He had just made a connection with audiences that no one had expected. It served as an early lesson in the harsh, unpredictable nature of celebrity for Howard. There was no loud, explosive strain. It was professional and calm. There was only a little change in dynamics, no public feuds or yelling confrontations. As his screen time decreased, Ron maintained his poise, as cast members subsequently recounted. Those involved in the production observed a change in his enthusiasm, although his work ethic never wavered. His early seasons were marked by an effortless enthusiasm that waned a little. He had started to go outside acting, yet he still gave warm, genuine performances. During pauses, Howard observed the team and inquired about lighting and cameras. The young actor was getting ready to go completely behind the camera after having a dream of telling stories from the inside out. Unexpectedly, Happy Days provided Howard with the last impetus to become a director. Not only did being overshadowed hurt his pride, but it also made his goal more clear. He came to the realization that he no longer wanted to pursue fame. He desired to construct it. He examined the change rather than hating it. He discovered how networks refocus on ratings, how to control creative egos without losing sight of the greater picture, and how audience chemistry may transform a show. His career as a filmmaker was built on such lessons. When questioned later about the change, Howard responded, "It taught me that just as people change, so do tales. You have two options: resist the change or take advantage of it." The latter was his choice. It all seems lyrical when viewed in retrospect. He gained the expertise to become one of Hollywood's most renowned directors from the same show that previously made him feel supplanted. His enduring friendship with Winkler is evidence that interpersonal relationships don't have to be destroyed by work-related conflict. Indeed, decades later, the two would publicly commend one another, with Winkler referring to Howard as the industry's most giving person. What started off as a friendly rivalry turned into respect for one another. It's not merely a tale of stolen attention when the supporting character steals the show. It's about being humble, growing, and having the grace to move away and yet be brilliant. Losing the lead role on Happy Days wasn't the end for Ron Howard. It marked the start of everything that followed. Mel Gibson is number 2. It appeared to be an ideal partnership when Ron Howard agreed to direct Ransom in 1996. He was already the steady hand of Hollywood, composed, meticulous, and well-liked. Mel Gibson, on the other hand, was at the top of his game. He carried himself not only as an actor but also as a creative force in his own right, and Braveheart had recently won multiple Oscars. With two flawless professionals pushing one another to achieve excellence, the coupling guaranteed fireworks. However, what actually happened was more of a struggle for dominance than a collaboration. The strain was not obvious to outsiders. The movie was tight, strong, and flawlessly made on screen. Two leaders engaged in combat behind the camera, one used quiet authority to guide, while the other used sheer willpower. Gibson's presence dominated the production from the beginning. He was full of ideas, incisive, and enthusiastic. However, that enthusiasm was accompanied by strong beliefs about everything. The tone of the performances around him, as well as the camera angles, tempo, and language. Howard, who valued cooperation above conflict, was abruptly forced to deal with an actor who sought to control every aspect. According to one crew member, Mel doesn't merely act in a scene. He desires to lead it, design it, and occasionally even rewrite it. Howard usually flourished in talks that were innovative. However, this was not a conversation. There was a discussion. Every modification turned into a discussion. Everybody has a creative control referendum. The continual friction was tiring for a man who was known for harmony. One of the film's dramatic pillars, a suspenseful kidnapping scene, was filmed during the crucial confrontation. Gibson reportedly insisted that the passage wasn't landing with enough raw energy, stopping production multiple times to suggest different line readings and staging options. Howard listened, made adjustments, and attempted to strike a balance between director authority and artistic respect. However, Gibson pressed harder the more he gave in. A lighting technician from the scene remarked, "Ron is a diplomat, but even he has limits." You could see him struggling to maintain control while keeping the peace that day by carefully considering every statement. In the end, Howard had to make a rare executive decision that halted production until he could rewrite the scene. It wasn't rage. It was reclaiming its precision. But this wasn't rebellion to Gibson. He treated acting with the same fervor he applied to directing. It was art. Thinking that complete emotional and creative commitment was required for the task. He saw pushing boundaries as a sign of dedication rather than disobedience. He acknowledged that their rhythms were significantly different in subsequent interviews, but he appreciated Howard's professionalism. For Howard, whose work was based on a delicate balance, the event confirmed a fundamental reality. A ship cannot be steered by two captains. Despite the chaos, Ransom was a success. The tension didn't detract from the film's critical and financial success. It gave it energy. Gibson gave a passionate and lived-in portrayal as a desperate, tense parent. Additionally, Howard's guidance provided structure and clarity. Together, they produced a controlled pandemonium that vibrated. The ideal combination of their divergent styles. But after everything was said and done, Howard left with conflicted emotions. He had demonstrated that he could control a strong personality without compromising the integrity of the movie. However, that management had a high cost. He was exhausted from the continual tugging and pushing. Even though he never publicly disparaged Gibson, people who knew him well understood that the collaboration had come to an end. Prepare yourself for our most important time. You will be astounded when Ron Howard introduces this last actor. It seemed like fate for Ron Howard to be given the opportunity to direct Marlon Brando in the mid-1990s. Brando was more than just a performer. The actor was him. Desire and The Godfather, the man who revolutionized cinema with a streetcar. Working with him was a once-in-a-lifetime experience for any director. It was something more profound for Howard. Professional recognition colliding with a childhood dream. As a child, he had studied Brando's performances and admired his ability to blend in with the character. From behind the camera, he would now have the opportunity to direct that same energy. However, what started out as an ideal partnership swiftly turned into one of Howard's most challenging situations. A sobering reminder that legends are sometimes best appreciated from a distance. The idea itself, a generational drama about an old patriarch facing the consequences of his history, was intended to be prestige content. It was ideal for Brando on paper. Intimate, yet big, and emotionally complicated. However, by this point in his life, the once exciting performer had earned a reputation for being uninterested, strange, and plain rebellious on set. Those rumors turned out to be accurate when production started. Brando demanded that his dialogue be scribbled on cue cards strewn over the set, arrived late, and was often unprepared. His attention seemed to stray from one instant to the next, crew members recalled, as though the screenplay itself were merely background noise for whatever thought was going through his head. He just so happened to have. Howard, who was renowned for his efficiency and order, found himself in charge of a living legend who showed no interest in following instructions. Initially, Howard took a patient approach to the task. He had always believed that respect begets respect, and he sought to gain Brando's trust by putting up with his eccentricities. However, it soon became apparent that this was hardly an instance of innovative experimenting. It was disdain. The crew would become confused when Brando would abruptly depart for hours at a time, insist on having entire sequences changed, or decide mid-shot that he wanted to investigate a different motivation. Every day seemed like roulette, as one assistant director put it frankly. You had no idea if you were going to get anarchy or genius. It wasn't exciting to be uncertain. It was draining. Additionally, it was like navigating a ship in fog with a captain who wouldn't read the map for a filmmaker who relied on preparation. A seemingly straightforward dialogue scene was the tipping point. What ought to have been a shot in the afternoon turned into a multi-hour drama. Brando regularly halted production, announced the lines below him, and then left the set without saying anything. He declared he had redesigned the character and wanted to start over from scratch when he returned 3 hours later. Always calm, Howard made an effort to adapt to the change while maintaining the production. In private, however, the tension was tremendous. The generally calm director appeared more reserved, figuring out how to keep the movie around its erratic star, as crew members later reported. The harm was done, yet the production stumbled along. What was supposed to be a groundbreaking creative partnership had turned into an endurance test. The project was never finished in its original form, for obvious reasons. While everyone behind the scenes knew that the project had simply become unmanageable, the publicly stated reasons were artistic disagreements and scheduling conflicts. Schedules had been thrown off, morale had vanished, and Howard's renowned patience had been put to the test beyond tolerance due to Brando's antics. For someone who had put a lot of effort into earning a professional reputation, this was a painful chapter that subtly tempered his views on leadership. Some legends earn their reputation through their work, he would later declare in interviews, without naming them. Others acquire it by their actions. Understanding the distinction is crucial. It was pointed out. Even legendary talent cannot justify rudeness. There you have it. The 6 performers who tested the limits of Hollywood's most amiable director. Legends, too, have their breaking points. Furthermore, respect on sight is seldom assured, as seen by Ron Howard's list. Which name caught you off guard the most? Do you believe that his patience was insufficient or excessive? Tell us in the comments section below. For more untold Hollywood stories, click the like button and subscribe. Don't leave either. For another startling behind-the-scenes look, click the video that is currently playing on your screen.